They said a heart can only break once, but on that rainy morning, it felt like the sky itself was crying for her. The clouds hung low like heavy curtains, trapping the sound of raindrops against umbrellas and the soft murmurs of those who came to say goodbye. The air was thick with the scent of wet soil and lilies, flowers that weren't just placed on the casket, but woven into the memories of everyone present. It wasn't just a funeral, it was the farewell to a future that would never unfold. Inside the church, the light passing through stained glass windows painted the room in deep blues and burning reds, colors that should have given comfort, yet only made the grief sharper. Umbrellas leaned against pews, abandoned like shields after a long battle. Tissues lay crumpled in hands that shook, not from cold, but from the weight of loss. People bowed their heads not only in prayer, but in disbelief, as if they were still waiting to wake up from a nightmare that refused to loosen its grip. At the center stood Dr. Layla Morgan, once introduced with titles, accolades, and applause wherever she went. She was celebrated nationwide as one of the youngest Supreme Court justices in American history, a symbol of excellence, discipline, and resilience. But none of that mattered today. Today, she wasn't Justice Morgan. She wasn't a public figure. She wasn't a headline. She was simply a mother trying to breathe while her heart demanded to shatter. Her son, Ethan Morgan, rested in a polished mahogany casket only a few steps away from her trembling hands. The white lilies draped across the lid weren't chosen for beauty, they were Ethan's favorite flower, a small detail she remembered from when he was 5 years old, running through a park trying to catch flower petals like snow. The memory hit her with such force that her knees nearly gave way. She inhaled slowly, trying to steady herself the same way she did before delivering rulings that changed history. But this wasn't a courtroom. There were no laws here, no rules, only grief. Ethan had just turned 17, a brilliant boy with a smile bright enough to warm even the coldest days. He wanted to be a pilot, not because of the thrill or the adventure, but because he loved the idea of rising above everything, of seeing the world from angles others overlooked. He would sit on the rooftop of their home, staring at airplanes, naming the models by their engines, imagining the places they were going. But dreams can't stop accidents, and one cruel night stole his future in seconds, leaving behind a mother who wasn't ready to say goodbye. People filled the pews, teachers who saw his potential, classmates who laughed at his jokes, neighbors who remembered him carrying groceries for the elderly without being asked. They whispered stories of his kindness, his generosity, his unstoppable curiosity. Some held hands while others held memories. Even those who barely knew him cried, overwhelmed by the sight of a mother holding her composure like someone balancing a fragile glass heart in her hands. The music swelled softly through the church, an instrumental hymn that seemed to reach into every corner of the room. Layla stepped forward, her footsteps small yet impossibly heavy. Her fingers brushed the wood of the casket as if touching the past itself. She let out a breath, just loud enough for the nearest mourners to hear, like a sigh caught between love and pain. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was barely a whisper. "Fly high, my boy. Mama's proud of you." Somewhere in the back row, someone began sobbing uncontrollably. Another person pressed their mouth to stop themselves from crying out loud. The silence that followed Layla's words wasn't empty. It was full of everything no one could say, full of questions that would never be answered, full of moments that would never happen. And then it happened. The heavy wooden doors of the church slammed open so hard that the echo cut through the music like a blade. Umbrellas rattled, heads snapped toward the entrance, the organist's fingers froze mid-key. The sudden sound didn't just interrupt the funeral, it shattered it. Officer Grant Henderson entered as though he owned the ground he walked on, his uniform soaked from the rain, but his posture rigid and unyielding. He moved with the cruel confidence of someone who believed rules didn't apply to him. To some, he looked like authority. To others, he looked like trouble wearing a badge. But to Layla, in that first split second, he was nothing but a stranger interrupting the worst moment of her life. His boots thudded against the church floor, each step louder than the last, echoing through the hall like a countdown to disaster. The congregation stiffened. The pastor blinked in confusion. An elderly woman clasped her necklace, whispering a prayer that this was some kind of misunderstanding. Officer Henderson didn't pause or lower his voice. He acted as if grief was irrelevant, as if tears had no rights, as if compassion could be discarded like a crumpled uniform. His hand tightened around a folded document, an arrest warrant, held up like a trophy no one asked to see. "I'm here for Dr. Layla Morgan," he announced, his voice booming through the quiet room. It was as though the air itself froze. At first, people didn't react because they couldn't quite believe what they heard. Slowly, whispers rippled through the rows. "What? Right now? Her? Here? During the funeral?" Layla's sister Serena was the first to recover. She moved forward, her eyes blazing, placing herself between Henderson and her grieving sister with the fierceness of a lioness protecting her family. "This is her son's funeral," she said, her voice trembling with fury. "You need to leave." Henderson didn't blink. "Dr. Morgan is under arrest for obstruction of justice," he repeated, louder as though volume could replace humanity. Wedding rings clinked as hands clenched into fists, phones lifted into the air, cameras flickered on. People stared in disbelief, some holding their breath, others recording every second, sensing instinctively that something historic and horrifying was unfolding in front of them. The organist attempted to speak. "Officer, please, have some respect. Let her—" But Henderson cut him off, stepping forward with the arrogance of someone who thought power justified cruelty. Layla slowly turned around, her eyes wet but her spine straight. Even in grief, she carried the presence of someone who had faced harsher battles in courtrooms filled with judgment, but nothing could have prepared her for this. "Let me see the warrant," she said quietly. He didn't hand it to her. Instead, he grabbed her wrist. A collective gasp filled the room, sharp, instinctive, horrified. For a heartbeat, everything stopped. Raindrops could be heard tapping against the windows, as if the storm outside paused to witness the storm inside. Someone whispered, "No, not like this." Someone else whispered, "She's mourning. How can he do that?" And somewhere in the back, a child asked his father, "Why is the police taking the sad lady?" Henderson tightened the cuffs, metal locking in place with a sound that would haunt everyone who heard it, the sound of dignity being shackled while the scent of lilies still hung in the air. People didn't know it yet, but in that moment, between grief and injustice, between silence and outrage, history shifted. What followed would spark protests in every corner of the country, ignite conversations about power and prejudice, and cost the police department $18 million. But for now, no one was thinking about money. No one was thinking about lawsuits. No one was thinking about consequences. All they saw was a uniform. All they saw was a grieving mother. All they saw was a storm that hadn't touched the ground yet, but was coming. The air inside the church turned ice cold as Officer Henderson marched forward, boots echoing louder than the organ still playing in the background, each step slicing through the tender moment like a blade. People felt as if winter itself had walked through the doors, stealing warmth from their bodies and silence from their prayers. He carried an arrest warrant high in his hand, as if it were a trophy proving his authority, gripping it with the pride of someone convinced they were untouchable, and the mourners stared in disbelief as if they were witnessing a nightmare unfold in slow motion. It wasn't just confusion that froze the room, it was outrage, disbelief, and a heavy sense of violation. Some guests clutched the sides of the pews for balance, others held damp tissues against their lips to stifle gasps. Layla's sister, who barely held herself together throughout the funeral, was the first to move, her protective instinct rising like a storm. She placed herself in front of Henderson, her voice shaking but fierce, demanding to know how an officer could interrupt a sacred moment, her nephew's funeral, a day meant to laying to rest a young soul whose dreams would never touch the sky again. Serena's eyes glimmered with equal parts grief and fire, but Henderson didn't blink, didn't flinch, didn't show even a flicker of hesitation. He announced loudly, his voice bouncing off stone walls, as if he believed thousands of invisible cameras were aimed at him, that Dr. Layla Morgan was under arrest for obstruction of justice, in an unrelated case, a charge that suddenly felt like a flimsy excuse masking something uglier. Gasps spread through the pews like wildfire, shock turning into whispers that tangled with the soft organ notes still hanging in the air. People rose from their seats, some with hands trembling so hard their phones nearly slipped from their fingers as they began recording, sensing instinctively that something historic and horrifying was happening in front of them. The organist cheerleaders, still wearing the sorrow of the hymn he'd just led, rushed toward Henderson with hands raised, pleading for compassion, for restraint, for a single moment of humanity on a day drenched in heartbreak.
but Henderson shoved past him without remorse, his face hardened into a mask of authority. The chiller stumbled back into the pews, and the sound of his shoe scraping across the floor echoed like a warning that nothing was safe anymore. Not grief, not dignity, not even farewells. Layla closed her eyes for a moment, steadying herself, feeling the chill of the cuffs against her skin and the unbearable emptiness where her son should have stood beside her, nervous but proud to watch people honor his life. Her breathing slowed, not from calm, but from devastation settling into her bones like winter frost. Henderson tugged her forward, his grip firm, his face unreadable, refusing to acknowledge the sea of disapproval crashing around him. But every person in that church knew they would never forget what they witnessed, that this moment would become a scar, not only on the memory of a funeral, but on the conscience of everyone present. Even the rain outside seemed to pause for a heartbeat, as if the storm clouds themselves were stunned.